All right. Up next, we have the Free Press's very own Rupa Subramanya to talk about debanking. Here's a short video about her new article, and we're going to talk to her right after this. Stay tuned.
We discovered this whole issue that we call banking while Muslim. My name is Chris. I'm the founder of a social enterprise called LaunchGood.com, and I was debanked. After 9/11, the government wanted to crack down on terrorism, and one of the means was terrorism financing. Through the Patriot Act, Congress gave banks the power to legally discriminate against anyone they suspect might be remotely involved with terrorism financing. In 2019, we were debanked by Stripe. It caught us off guard. They had started closing a number of our clients' accounts, and we didn't understand why or what was going on. LaunchGood is a crowdfunding platform like GoFundMe or Kickstarter, and we allow Muslims to fundraise to support good works in the world. And what are one of the keys to finding terrorists? Well, they use these naming lists. The two most sanctioned names in the world are Muhammad and Abdul. And if you're a business that has a lot of Muslim customers, you're going to have a lot of people named Muhammad and Abdul doing transactions. At some point, bank says this is just too prone to risk. We're going to shut you down, and we have the right to. Even though it might be Ali Khan in Michigan, and he's totally unrelated to Ali Khan in Pakistan, who's alleged terrorist, it marks as a hit. We switched to Chase's compliance software. 50% of the donations were being blocked. We even have an email from them. Our account manager was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. You have so many Arabic/Muslim names. It's confusing our compliance software." Which, of course, that's not my problem. You have a discriminatory compliance software. LaunchGood's never been involved in any terrorism financing ever. And any time a bank has kicked us off, there's never actually a specific allegation. There's nothing to respond to. There's no appeal process. And it can be completely unjustified, and it could ruin a business. We can't just allow legal discrimination. Otherwise, banks can just kick off whoever they want for whatever reason.
Rupa, you're Canadian. I always say that like it's some sort of accusation.
Hey, Michael.
You're Canadian. Just admit it, Rupa. You're Canadian. I bring that up because, Rupa, the first time I really heard debanking talked about was in this trucker convoy in Canada. These people who were involved in having their money seized. But your piece says this is not only coming to America, has come to America. Give us a sense of what you found in your reporting.
Thanks, Michael. Everybody has heard about debanking investors during the truckers' protest. These people, for just showing up or for having donated to the truckers' protest, were then subsequently debanked, and their accounts were restored eventually. But the fact is that they were debanked for at least a few days. The fact of the matter is that this is the financial surveillance state is now big everywhere. We heard what happened in the UK with Nigel Farage last year, where he was debanked for his political views. One of the chief executives of that bank had to resign subsequently. We've heard debanking, of course, here in Canada, but in the US, what's interesting is that the financial system was essentially weaponized against Americans for their political and ideological views. It really started under Barack Obama. These were anti-terrorism laws that were conceived just after 9/11. The idea then was to go after terrorists, foreign terrorists. But what ended up happening really, and it really began with Operation Choke Point under Barack Obama, where his administration did not like gun dealers, payday lenders, and so on. They found these businesses to be unsavory. And so they went after them by trying to choke them out of business. That's why it was called Operation Choke Point. That continued on for a few years. It was pretty controversial, and then Trump put an end to Operation Choke Point. It turns out that the financial surveillance mechanism didn't really expand much under Trump. In fact, I don't think he really did anything. But it's been at full force under the Biden administration, and so many of the examples that I cite in my story.
Yeah, Rupa, can I get you to talk about one of those, because I think when I start talking about the trucker protest and people think of January 6th, which you do mention in your piece, it is just a bunch of kind of right-wing weirdos. Whereas you start the piece with a discussion of LaunchGood, which is a Muslim kind of donation website to set up for various Muslim causes. They have been debanked. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, LaunchGood is the world's largest crowdfunding platform for Muslims. It's like the GoFundMe for Muslims around the world, and they do a lot of good work. And they've also raised money for the synagogue shooting that happened a few years ago in Philadelphia. They've raised money for the mosque shooting in New Zealand a few years ago. And what happened with LaunchGood is that they have run into compliance problems over and over again, starting with Stripe, a payments processor, and every now and again they find themselves offboarded because of compliance issues, and they're never told why. They're never given a reason why they've been offboarded. And that's the theme throughout, whether it is the CEO of LaunchGood, Chris Blauvelt, whom I interviewed for the story, or Stephen Horn, who went to Capitol Hill as an independent journalist to capture that moment. Whether it is him, whether it's Chris or Stephen Horn or Melania Trump, for that matter. There's a pattern here where people get this mysterious email from the banking institution saying your risk profile just doesn't match our compliance, and it's just we're not happy with your risk profile, and so we can no longer do any business with you. And that's it. That's where it ends. And people are just left wondering, well, what is going on here? What did I do? Why am I being treated like a bad person? Why am I being treated like I'm involved in something nefarious? And this has happened across the board. It's happened to Muslim Americans. It's happened to evangelical Christians doing charity work in places like Uganda, for example. As I mentioned, it's happened to Melania Trump. So it's caught everybody, every American, and it really is quite disturbing, because once you are not part of the financial system, you really have nothing.
So, Rupa, I thought this was a very good article, even allowing for your Canadian presuppositions, which have to be baked in. And as I read it, I was thinking, okay, first they come for Chris Blauvelt, Chris Abdurraham Blauvelt, and I said nothing. And then they come for the January 6th guy. But when they came for Barron Trump, I was put on edge. That was it. So this is my analysis. It is one of those classic situations where you have a regulator and they are unincentivized for doing anything about false positives. And they are so in fear of false negatives, allowing an actual terrorist organization to be funded, that I don't know what the ratio is. No one could ever know, but it's probably in the thousands to one of dinging the false positives. Another situation like this is parole or criminal justice and allowing people out on bail because people are so afraid of getting it wrong. So the question is, what breaks, well, first of all, is that your assessment of it, but what breaks that dynamic? They are at loggerheads. How do you get anyone to say we have to perhaps risk a false negative? 1 out of 10,000 people we debank might have turned out to be a criminal enterprise, but the cost of that or the price of that is not worth paying.
Well, you see, you're never going to get a bank, an official in a bank, to ever come close to saying, what you're proposing, because they're bound by something called the Bank Secrecy Act. And the Bank Secrecy Act was essentially fortified, strengthened after 9/11 under the Patriot Act. So the banks are under no obligation to tell you anything at all with respect to your account, why you were debanked. And so, the closest they've come to saying is that, well, it's just an algorithm. I think the algorithm just sweeps up all of these people, and so inadvertently this person.
But how is that exculpatory? Aren't they just admitting that they're doing it wrong by using the word algorithm?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, these are not official statements from banks. These are former banking officials who are sort of speaking off the record or on background or whatnot. The point is that as long as you have the Bank Secrecy Act, which really in a sense, strengthens the relationship between the state and the financial system, you're not going to get many answers. And that,
yeah, Rupa, before we go, I just want to ask you about that, because that is the key here, right? It's between the state and the financial system, right? I mean, I think a lot of people would say, you get kicked off of Twitter, it's a private company, Bank of America might be huge, but it's a private bank. I mean, I know they've been doing this for a long time. You might not believe this was because I did a story, but I did a story one time where I was speaking to porn stars who had been debanked because of the immorality of where their money came from. You see this often with OnlyFans people. That's not a regulatory issue, that's a morals issue. But what you're talking about here is this is the government turning the screws on people. And, do you suspect the banks would be involved in this business at all? Would they care at all if it wasn't for government intervention and oversight?
Well, that's a great question, and this is something that I asked everybody that I interviewed. Let's take that example of the FBI whistleblower who, he told me that Bank of America volunteered this information to the FBI without the FBI even asking for this information. And this was a list of all of the people who were protesting on January 6th, and they were in and around Capitol Hill or in the DC area on that day. And Bank of America essentially, and if they bought a cup of coffee, Bank of America had a record of that, and they passed this information on to the FBI. And so the FBI, according to this whistleblower testimony, George Hill, whom I spoke to, said, well, why are you giving us this information? What do you want us to do with this information? And so that's the disturbing reality of this. So I asked George, I said, well, why do you think they did this? Well, there are two possible reasons. So he gave me a mafia analogy. The FBI just shows up innocuously at a bank saying, we're investigating so-and-so here. If you have any information, do pass this on to us. That's really a warning of sorts. It would be a shame if your house burned down, right? It would be a shame if your restaurant burned down kind of analogy. And then there's also this patriotic, I think, compulsion. I think banks feel like they're doing something good here by trying to help the authorities to go after the bad guys. So I think
Rupa,
both things are at play.
Thank you so much for that, and we will look forward to your next blockbuster piece. And I also want to thank Mike Pesca. I'm reluctant to do that.